The first thing I remember is the metal taste of the sun on my face and the weight of the tupper of mole in my hands. It was one of those Sundays when the city smells different. Mole in the air from the neighbor's kitchen, the jacarandas lining the street like a string of careful purple coins. I had wrapped my shoulders in my rebozo the way my mother taught me, knotted it the way Vicente used to like, and walked up to my son's door with the food his abuela used to make. I pressed the doorbell, 3 quick rings. I could hear the hum of a television through the door, the kind of afternoon sound that tells you people are safe inside, drinking coffee they're not fully awake to. The door opened. Her face blocked the light, and then the door slammed like a judge's gavel. "Not again!" she shouted. The slam cut the syllable off. My tupper almost slipped from my hands. Her voice was sharp, like someone had trained their mouth to be quick with words and slow with tenderness. I stood on the step, feeling the heat from the concrete under my shoes, feeling my hands wrinkle more than usual, feeling the mole in the tupper cool against my fingers. Days later, she called asking for money. Those 2 sentences, one full of sound and smell, the other full of silence and expectation, are the bookends to what became several years of hurt and then later of hard-won dignity. You can imagine my confusion. The woman who had slammed the door in my face was the same one who would pick up the phone and ask me for 28,000 pesos as if I were an automatic bank. You can imagine how that felt. The sting, the shame, the small voice inside that said, maybe you were wrong to think family always acts like family. If you like true stories of courage, subscribe. I'll tell you why I say that now. I'm Remedios. I am 68 years old. I say it not to make a show of age, but so you understand why I can point to history when I talk about what happened. My hands have worked a long time. I learned to sew when I was a girl, my machine biting and spitting under my fingers until my stitches were straight as I wanted them. I learned to bargain in the tianguis of Iztapalapa with a smile and with the same firmness that later led me to sell the house my husband and I had built. Vicente and I bought that house with the slow courage of people who pick up the last coins and count them twice. He worked at the workshop down the street until his hands were calloused and the smell of oil lived in his shirts. I sewed and sold, and sometimes we would sit in the courtyard with a plate of mole and talk about the future like stranger lovers, tentative, hopeful. We raised Fabian there. We painted his room the color of marigolds. I remember him as a small boy, bringing me coffee in a chipped mug, his breath hot and proud. When Vicente died, the house became a box full of memories and grief, and all those memories began to feel to me like something that could be converted into survival.
We sold the house for 2,850,000 pesos. I say the number because I want you to know how real it was. Numbers in stories can feel like fiction, but for me that amount was the sound of a door closing on one life and opening to another. I used the money, as most parents do when they believe in their children. I gave what I could to help Fabian buy a place of his own. He was an adult, 40 plus now, and he had been struggling. The down payment for their house was supposed to be a fresh start for him, for Karina, for the family. At first it was just that. A new home filled with promise. We celebrated. We filled the kitchen cabinets with the kinds of spices that smell like the market on Saturday. I would bring food and sit at the table, and for a while everything felt like the picture I had imagined when I counted coins in the night. My son stable, a family that welcomed me, the house carrying on as a place where I could belong. But belonging, I learned, can be negotiated in small ways. You don't always notice what's being changed until the changes are house-sized. They started with comments that were small and sharp. "Your rebozo is worn," she said once, in front of the others, when I had draped it around my shoulders the way I always do. The rebozo is a thing of comfort for me, a memory and a warmth. She said it with the dry laugh of a person cataloging things as if deciding whether they were worthy. Another time, she handed me a disposable tupper for my mole, as if suggesting I should be grateful for anything at all. I felt the burn of those words like a small coal in my throat. My hands had made that mole. Those hands had turned fabric into shirts that put bread on our table. I could have smiled. For a while I did. Then the rules came. Visits were no longer soft and spontaneous. They became a schedule like a bus timetable. "Thursdays from 4 to 6, Karina announced, with the efficiency of someone who sterilizes everything for a guest. I learned to show up at 4 on Thursdays, to set a pocket of time aside like an appointment, to measure my joy in minutes and seconds. I can tell you the clock in their kitchen with the little plastic rooster on it became a kind of jail. If I stayed past 6, I felt her eyes like a ruler across my shoulders. There were nights when the television volume would drop when I walked in, as if my presence had pulled down the living room like a curtain. There were comments about my hair, about how I dressed. "You should dye your hair," she once said, and I felt the word dye scrape like sand across the inside of my skull. At dinner, plates were rearranged as if to say, "We keep this corner for us and that one for you, abuela." I stopped bringing things sometimes because the baton of welcome had been tossed and misplaced. The worst of it were not the words alone. It was the way the words built a staircase across him, my son, until he was standing on a higher step, and I had to look up to find his face.
Fabian began to distance himself from small things and large. He would call and say, "I'll be late," with the kind of voice that held the weight of someone trying to balance. I would see him sit between us once, trying to negotiate us both into some kind of peace, and I would watch his eyes flick to Karina as if asking permission to breathe. Then the manipulations began to have a shape that I could name. There was a time, one particular evening I still wake at night remembering, when I received a call that my granddaughter, her child, had been hurt. My feet felt hollow as I ran out of the house. I took a taxi, my breath loud in my chest, only to find that the child was fine. I remember the sterile brightness of that emergency room, my hands clasped around a receipt, my heart banging like a drum. Later I learned there had been no emergency at all. It had been a call designed to test scripts. How would I react, and could I be moved? Another moment that stays with me happened in front of the family, the week of a birthday. I had sewn a dress for a neighbor's child, and I wore it to the table, proud as a mother. Karina made a joke about homemade like it was a thing to be embarrassed by. People laughed politely, and I felt small and very alone. Little by little, these moments held me like a net. Perhaps what hurt most was the way the house they had bought with my help became a place where I was tolerated rather than loved. I tried to adjust, of course. My instinct is to keep the peace. I would fold my rebozo tighter and smooth the creases of my patience. I would cook and bring things, because it was easier to put a plate on the table than to explain the thing that was breaking inside me. But there are limits to what kindness can hold. I thought for a while that the problem was only pride. Maybe Karina had suffered a hard life in the past and was protecting herself with sharp words.
Maybe she wanted things to be a certain way. Maybe I had done something to offend a household rule I did not know existed. People told me to be patient. I tried. I was patient like a woman can be when she remembers her mother's voice telling her to keep a lid on shame. Then came the money. It was a phone call that could have been ordinary. I remember exactly where I was. I had been mending a shirt at the kitchen table, the thread a stubborn friend that kept knotting. The phone rang. I picked it up and heard Karina's voice, but it was different, brisk, rehearsed. "Doña Remedios," she said, "we need help." I answered, "Of course. What is it?" "We need 28,000 pesos. It's necessary. We'll pay you back," she said. The words were simple and automatic, as if they'd been practiced in front of a mirror. I could feel the air change in the room, like a storm cloud rolling over the house. 28,000 pesos is a lot for a woman who counts thread by the meter. I had helped with the down payment.
I had sold a home that held Vicente's smell to make a life for him. I had trusted that the help would be for building a house, not for plugging holes in a roof made of weakness and habit. "Why?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line, a swallowing. "We need the money for a debt," she said. "It's urgent." "Who did you owe?" I asked. "Just trust me," the voice tightened. Something in me hardened, not because I want to be hard, not because I wanted to refuse, but because there had been so many moments before this, moments where a small kindness was returned with a dismissal. I remembered the disposable tapper, the rules, the slam of the door. I remembered the emergency room light. I thought of the 2,850,000 pesos poured into the future, the price we had paid. "No," I said. I heard the intake of breath like a punch. "Please, Doña Remedios," Karina pleaded. "We'll make it up to you. We'll—" "No," I repeated. My voice was low. I felt the sound like a seed being planted. "No, Karina, I cannot." She did not argue. She dropped the request like someone letting go of a stone, hoping it would roll away and take the sound with it. I heard the line click as she hung up. My hands were shaking. The thread on the table stared back at me like a thin white accusation. After that, our house became a stage. The next day, Fabian came to the phone angry and hurt. He accused me of refusing them something they needed. He said things that cut in a way I had not expected, that I didn't understand what it was like to be young with debts. He told me I had been selfish. He used the word selfish the way his father used a tool, precise, blunt. I tried to explain. I tried to tell him about the selling of the house and how my chest still ached with that decision. I tried to tell him about the mending and the sewing and Vicente's laugh that used to fill our kitchen. He raised his voice in a way that frightened me. The son I had raised, who used to bring me coffee, sounded distant and furious. He told me, finally, to stop meddling in their affairs. The door slammed. The screen door banged with that particular metallic sound that always makes me think of a pot boiling over. I stood there with my hand on the receiver, feeling as if the floor had tilted and I had been left to find my footing. I went to sleep that night with the dim light of the kitchen clock watching over me. In the silence, I heard the old promises we had made when we were young and foolish. I thought about how many times I had given, fully convinced that love would return the favor. I thought about the 2,850,000 pesos and wondered if you could really measure love with numbers, if kindness has a receipt someone eventually hands back with interest. And then, as if the past were a drawer that opens at the right pressure,
I found something I had forgotten.
It was a box of papers tucked away in the back of a cabinet. Contracts, receipts, and leaning at an angle like a note waiting for someone to come home, a letter from Vicente. I had not read it in years. I touched the paper and the handwriting came through like a map I had once known by heart. The letter was simple. He did not use many words. In his slow pen strokes, he told me to keep watch over myself. He wrote, in a way only he could, that love does not mean letting someone feed on you until nothing remains. He wrote that there is strength in saying no when a no is the only honest answer. It was not a long sermon. It was the voice of the man who had called me to eat mole at dusk and had held my hand through fever nights. Beside the letter, folded under the corner, I found the contract, a set of papers with the name of the house and clauses that I had signed on the day we sold it. My eyes skimmed the legal language and then caught a paragraph that I had never noticed before. It spoke of rights retained by the seller in certain eventualities. It was not for me to interpret the law in this moment, but what I felt was like finding a key under a rug, an unexpected opening. The papers trembled in my hands. In the room, the shadows felt larger. Discovery does strange things to a body. It makes you feel hollow and full at the same time. My heart began to beat in the rhythm of someone who has decided to do something she thought she had lost the strength to do. I went to bed that night with the letter beside me and the thought that perhaps there was a path to balance the scales. I called Doña Lydia the next morning. She has lived across the street from us for 30 years and knows the melody of our family the way you know a neighbor's chicken. I told her about the doorbell and the tapper and the phone call. She did not seem surprised. "It's not right," she said. Her voice held a quiet fire that always made me feel braver. She suggested that I keep a record, receipts, conversations, dates. I nodded because when people you trust tell you small practical things, you feel less alone. I also kept a small, secret hope that all this would be a storm that would pass. People change, I told myself. They find their manners after they have lost them. But the phone call with the 28,000 pesos was not a mistake. It was a pattern. For months it was one thing after another, requests that arrived like drifts of debris in the mail. Urgent debts here, a forgotten bill there. Each time they asked, a piece of my confidence was taken in pennies and then in pesos until I feared I would have nothing left to stand on. There was one evening in particular when everything came to a head. I had baked a small cake for a family gathering. Nothing grand, just a sponge with a thin sugar crust. I carried it in with the gentle pride of someone who wants to mark the day.
Karina took one look and said in front of the others, "We're ordering something better." The comment felt like a hand pushing me off a small cliff into humiliation. People laughed a little. My son looked away. Later, in the privacy of the kitchen, he told me he was tired of arguing. "Tired?" I asked him. "Yes," he said, rubbing his forehead. "It's messy, Mama." I wanted to tell him that messy had a history, that the reasons behind what we do are often tangled in the same fabric, but he was younger than I, and his anger was a force he did not yet know how to contain. He called Karina later that night, and between them they made decisions that did not include me. So I began to change my small habits. I stopped bringing the tappers sometimes. I stopped showing up on Thursday too early. I began to understand that kindness without boundaries is not kindness. It is a highway for someone else's appetite. Yet setting boundaries felt like learning to walk anew. There was guilt. There was a loneliness like a winter. And then I decided to look closer at the papers. I unfolded the contract again. I read the letter from Vicente until his words felt like a hand at my back. The clause I had found about retained rights was not a miracle. It was a fact on paper. It was a tool that could, perhaps, give me leverage to ask for what I needed. Clarity, respect, maybe some compensation for what had been taken.
I was not thinking of revenge. I was thinking of dignity. I did not know what all of this would mean yet. Only I knew that the sting of the "not again" and the abruptness of a phone call asking for 28,000 pesos had marked an end of a kind of innocence. Something needed to shift. When I told my neighbor, Doña Lidia, about the paper, she put her hand over mine in a way that felt like an offering, simple and strong. "You're not alone," she said. "You know where we are." That night, I sat on my small balcony with a cup of coffee gone cold because I could not sleep. The city hummed below. In the distance, a radio played an old bolero, and I thought about how we sometimes think our lives will be songs that repeat. They do not. They change keys. It was in that key change that I decided I would not allow myself to be diminished. I called a lawyer. I am not going to give you details of how to do such a thing. This is not advice, and I cannot teach legal steps. But I will tell you this. When I spoke with Licenciado Bernardo Campos, I felt like someone had taken the knot from my throat. There is a moment in a person's life when names and papers and formalities begin to look like armor. I sent a copy of the papers. He listened and did not laugh at my fears. He said the right things, not promises, but possibilities. On the afternoon, I walked up to their door with another tapper, this time just a small container with leftover frijoles. I was ready for anything.
I had the letter, the papers, Doña Lidia's clear eyes, and the knowledge that I had tried patience, and it had not been enough. I did not want to make enemies. I wanted to be treated as a human being who had given and deserved to be treated with decency. I did not know then how public the things we keep private can become. I did not know how many people would end up sitting at that table, how many receipts would be counted under the hard light of truth. I did not know if their promise to get help would stick, or if a process would take more than I had patience for. I only knew that the next steps would not be taken with my head down. When the door opened that Sunday and she shouted, "Not again!" I had thought of smaller things. I had not yet allowed myself to imagine a scene with witnesses, with evidence, with family sitting in a room where words would land like plates on a table and not fall broken. I had not yet planned a confrontation. I had only begun to pull the threads. Inside my chest, something was starting to change from a bruise into a steady burn. The word "no" lay in my mouth like a seed. Saying it once had not been enough. Saying it twice would not be the end. There were papers and a letter and a lawyer. There were neighbors who knew the rhythm of our life. There was also, painfully, the distance of a son who had been taught to look away. I went home that evening and set the tapper down on my counter. I took Vicente's letter from the drawer and smoothed its edges. I read his words again. He wrote of strength and love in the language of a man who had built a life with his hands and who knew what sacrifice cost. What comes next will not be a sudden victory. It will be a series of small, stubborn acts. It will be asking for what is right in a world that thinks the elderly should be quiet. It will be listening to my own voice and making it the one that guides me. For a long time, I had tried to be small to keep the peace. The price of that peace became clear when a woman I had helped turned to me with a phone and a list of debts. For now, I had a plan of sorts. I would gather the proofs. I would speak. I would not be ashamed to ask for repayment of what had been used in ways I had not intended. I would also not humiliate someone who suffers. Karina's gambling was not a character trait, but an illness, a thing that also required compassion. But compassion, I had learned, should not be the same thing as erasure. The next morning, the news traveled in our building. People asked me what would happen. Children from the street looked at me differently, some with curiosity, some with pity.
My friend, Laura, whose family had known Karina's parents, Javier and Laura, came by with 2 tamales and sat me down. "You did not deserve that," she said. "You deserve to be respected." I set down my cup and listened. In those small domestic moments, I began to collect the courage I would need for the rest of it.
I thought of the day I sold the house and how often the willingness to give can be a bridge and sometimes a lightning rod. I thought of Vicente's voice on the paper and how his words felt like permission to be whole again. And I thought, finally, of the sound of that door slamming. Not just the anger in the slam, but the echo it left. It had been an act meant to close me out. Now I understood it was simply the start of a longer sentence. I would not finish it in silence. I would speak, gather, and stand. So I began to write. I wrote down dates. The phone call for 28,000 pesos was on a Tuesday. The night of the emergency call, false, was on a Thursday, the same week we had been invited to dinner that never included me. The cake comment at the family table was on the Monday before the phone call. Each thing felt small on its own. Together they formed a pattern, like stitches that sewn into a long seam. When I folded the list into my pocket, I felt oddly calm, not because I had all the answers, but because I had the map to where I needed to go. The map began with paper and a memory and the word no. The map led, possibly, to a meeting where words would be laid on the table like plates. I do not know if Fabian will forgive me in the way my heart wishes, or if Karina will accept help for what she needs. I know only that my dignity, once sold in the currency of a home, could be reclaimed in other ways. I do not seek revenge. I seek to be treated as a person, not a purse from which one can take what is wanted. The day I decided to act, the jacarandas were already shedding their purple confetti on the sidewalk. I wrapped my rebozo around my shoulders and went downstairs. The city smelled like rain on hot asphalt, and the smell reminded me that things change with weather. The door opened, and for a moment I imagined the same face and the same old voice. What happened next would need witnesses and time. I had the paper, the letter, and a quiet resolve that had been born, strangely, out of hurt and stitch work and the slow, steady work of keeping a home together. When I knocked again, I felt the press of every past kindness. I thought of the mole in my tupper and how cooking for those you love is a prayer. I thought of Vicente's handwriting and the way he had always said the truth softly. They would know when I opened my mouth that I had been patient. They would know, too, that patience is not limitless, and because I believe in truth, I would speak it plainly. I would speak it plainly. The morning after I set the list of dates in my pocket, I felt the weight of every small wound. It was as if the city had shrunk, and the sound of my own step was louder. I made coffee and let it cool beside the window while the street below arranged itself into its usual chorus, vendors calling, a bicycle bell, a shout across the way. I took Vicente's letter from where I'd left it open on the kitchen table and read it again. He had a way of writing that made ordinary things feel like promises. "Be brave," he had written, "and do not let anyone eat your years." Brave was a new costume. I tied it on awkwardly. I called Licenciado Bernardo and told him I was ready. He asked me questions, gentle, practical ones, and I answered with the list folded in my pocket. He did not make me feel foolish. When he came to my little home for the first time, he wore the patient look of someone who knows paperwork better than people. We sat at my table, the same table that had once held 3 plates and now often held 1, and he read the clause aloud. I listened to the words blur at the corners, but one thing was clear. There were documented transfers, receipts, dates, and a paragraph that spoke of compensation if the buyer used funds for purposes other than those declared at the time of sale. "It is not magic," he said, and I liked his honesty, "but it is something we can present. You are not asking for vengeance. You are asking for accountability." Accountability, another strange garment, heavier than brave, but fitting. We made a list of witnesses. Doña Lidia, of course, Laura, who knew both families, a neighbor who had seen the way Carina rolled her eyes. I rehearsed nothing. I only let the truth sit in my mouth like a clear flavor. The next step was a notification, a formal letter delivered to the house with copies of my receipts, a polite but firm request to discuss the use of funds and propose a resolution. Licenciado Bernardo delivered it himself, his steps slow and decisive. There are many ways to make something real. For me, it was the difference between a telephone that can be hung up and a piece of paper that crosses a hand and says, "This is what happened." The afternoon he came to the door with the letter, I stood on the step and watched it unfold. Carina's face was a mask, and Fabian hovered behind her like someone who did not know whether to enter the room or run. I felt no triumph, only a hollow of tiredness and the same little fire that Vicente's handwriting had sparked. A meeting was scheduled. It was not behind closed doors at first. Licenciado requested a neutral room at a small community center, a table, plain chairs, good light. I asked Doña Lidia to come. She sat in the front and held my hand like a bar of soap in a palm, wiry and strong. Laura came, her face like a watercolor of sympathy. Javier and Laura, Carina's parents, arrived with faces that held both surprise and an awkward shame. They were older than me, and in their eyes I saw the weight of a different kind of pride, of children who had become strangers to their own home language. We laid out the papers one by one. Bank transfers were shown. Receipts for small cash withdrawals were placed on the table. The disposable tapper, the one that had stung me so, sat there like a small witness. The false emergency was recounted by me and corroborated by a nurse who had been at the clinic that night and remembered a woman who had come to the desk asking questions but without a patient in need. That nurse, Maria, had come forward because she had seen how the calls had raided my sleeping hours. She signed a short statement. Nobody said the words guilt aloud, but it filled the room. Carina's hands trembled. Fabian kept looking away. Javier and Laura spoke softly to their daughter in a way that made me think of kitchen conversations and scoldings that used to be more direct and clear. It was painful to listen to their voices as they tried to do what parents sometimes do, cover for a child. But the papers made shelter thinner. Facts have a way of asking people to face what they hoped was concealment. Licenciado explained that there were options, but no guarantees. He spoke calmly about possibilities of recovering some of the funds and about measures to ensure that if money was to be returned, it would be done with responsibility and under supervision. He did not offer me a fairy tale. He offered me patience, process, and the language of accountability. What I am willing to accept is a plan, I told them. I felt my throat dry. I do not want to be the one who ruins anyone. I want to be treated with respect. I want what was used for other things to be returned. I ask for therapy for the gambling because I believe she needs help, and I ask for honesty. Carina cried then. It was not the kind of wail that steals a room. It was thin and raw. She said her name aloud like someone learning it again. "I'm sorry," she whispered, to me, to Fabian, to everyone. She admitted she had a problem with gambling. She used a word I had learned later, ludopatia, and she said she had been ashamed to tell anyone. Shame had been the lock that had kept the truth under the table. Now it rattled once. Her parents promised to help with payments.
They sat with their hands folded and said their own apologies. Fabian's eyes shone with a new thing, confusion certainly, but also the first stirrings of guilt. He said little at that first meeting. He was a man split between two loves, and I could see his core shaking. We all agreed on terms, a schedule of payments to begin, a commitment to therapy for Karina with proof of enrollment, a request that financial decisions of large value be communicated and documented. There is a strange relief when a plan exists, not a solution, but a map. The payments arrived like slow rain. The first one was small. A humble envelope slid into my hand in a street outside the bank. It had 28,000 pesos in it, the exact amount Karina had asked for in that phone call, and a note scratched by her father. For the debt you did not deserve. I felt my fingers close on bills like planting seeds. I did not slip them into my pocket right away. I put them on the table and watched them as if looking at a sprout.
The envelope meant everything and nothing. It meant recognition, finally. It also meant the long road of purchases missed and trust frayed. Karina attended therapy in small steps. The first appointment was a small step into a room with a teal couch and a woman with watchful eyes who asked her to start where she could. Karina's voice was quieter when she told me about the sessions. It was not immediate redemption. It was a person working through something that had been hidden. I tried to give it space. Fabian's change was slower, as if forgiveness was a bridge he had to build plank by plank. He apologized in person one afternoon, in the hallway outside his house, with both of his hands in his pockets, like a boy again. He said that he had been ashamed to stand up to his wife, and that the things he said in anger were things he would carry. He told me that he had not known how to be a man in the middle, and that he had chosen the wrong side too often. "Forgive me," he said, and the words were soft, not heroic. I looked at him and wanted to take him into my arms and press all the years back into him. Instead, I put my hand on his cheek like you smooth a wrinkle from a tablecloth, gentle, practical. "We will walk forward," I said, "but with rules." We made the rules slowly. Visits were not confiscated, but arranged honestly. Money would not be given without discussion. If he wanted to help his parents, mine and theirs, he would be clear. It was a small renaissance of language. No more coded messages behind laughter. No more appointments to measure my belonging. People watched us. The neighbors who had once whispered when I walked by now tipped their hats and said good morning, as if the rumors had been washed. Doña Lidia would come by and sit on my stoop and gossip about small things, and her laugh sounded to me like the re-emergence of a community that had once been ours. Meanwhile, I started to spend the money in ways that felt like ceremonies. The dentist's chair had intimidated me for years. My teeth had learned to speak in a softened way, so I could hide with a closed mouth. I invested in a few dental appointments. I paid a woman who fixed my hair in a color that felt like a new dawn. I bought myself a jacket with sturdy buttons and a scarf of wool that hugged my neck in winter. They were not extravagances. They were reparations to an older version of myself. But perhaps the most significant thing I did was buy a small apartment. Not to make a point, not to vanish. I chose a modest place with a little balcony that looked on to a street of jacarandas. I signed the papers slowly. I slept 2 nights like a woman who had finally put warm sheets onto a bed in winter. The apartment was proof to myself that the life I had sold could be rebuilt in pieces that kept my dignity intact. There were hard days. Payments sometimes came late.
Promises sometimes cracked and fell. Karina had relapses, small ones, the kind that people with addictions face as part of the path.
Each time there was a setback, the family convened a small emergency meeting. Sometimes they were apologetic, sometimes defensive. I learned that patience is not the same as weakness. It is a choice to hold a line while still learning to open your hand when healing arrives. One stormy night, months later, I found myself sitting across from Karina in a small waiting room while she filled out a form for yet another session. Her face was drawn. She looked less like the woman who had once slammed a door and more like someone shaving away a rough edge. We did not speak about the past at first. We spoke about small things, the color of the walls in her house, a recipe she missed from her mother. It was an awkwardness, like two seamstresses trying to stitch a new cloth together. "I was ashamed," she said finally. The words were brittle. "I did not know how to ask for help." "I know," I said, "but shame hides in silence. We need medicine for that, too." She began to talk more. She wanted to pay back what she could. She enrolled in a support group. She wrote a letter to me once that I kept folded in a drawer. In it, she asked for the chance not to be defined by what she had done. I read the letter like a map of a person learning to find a way home. Time does something quiet. It softens contours without forgetting them. It teaches you how to iron a crease without erasing the fabric. There was a moment, a year or so after the first meeting, when the family sat in a small backyard for a potluck. The food was simple: tacos de guisado, rice, a pot of mole that smelled like the first Sunday I rang the bell. Karina came with a dessert she had made herself. She was not the same woman who shouted. She seemed thinner at the edge, but more present. Fabian sat beside her with a careful calm. He had learned to speak with less judgment and more responsibility. He served me a plate and said, "This is for you, Mama." I took the plate and ate. There was no big reconciliation scene with fireworks. There was only a plate and a hand that reached for mine across the table in a small apology. Javier and Laura, Karina's parents, kept their promises. They made monthly payments for some of what had been used. They came to meetings and sat in a room where conversations were sometimes heavy and sometimes hopeful. They, too, had to relearn how to be parents who could not fix all things, only bear witness to their child's change. I saw the strain on them and felt compassion as well as justice. The legal process wrapped around us like a slow belt. Papers were signed, payments scheduled, therapy documented. Nothing dramatic happened overnight. That was the most important lesson. Healing and restitution do not arrive as fireworks. They come as a tally of small acts. As the months passed, I slowly regained my social life. I began to write letters to a local radio program that read the stories of neighbors.
I told short, honest pieces about cooking, about the cost of kindness, about how to place a boundary like a fence that can still be loved over time. People wrote back. One woman sent me a photograph of her abuela and a note saying she had listened with tears. I began to think that my story could give others a shape for their own. Money can change hands and houses can be bought, but the thing that felt most radical for me was reclaiming a voice. I started volunteering at a community center, teaching sewing to a few young mothers who wanted to make clothing to sell in the Tianguis. The room smelled of cloth and starch and possibility.
Teaching gave me a purpose beyond being owed something. It allowed me to return to the simple work of making things that could sustain a household. Fabian found kindness in a new partner, Patricia. She is a woman who cooks with laughter and who meets my eyes without flinching. She is not a savior, she is a person who holds her own life and does not fear the years of another. When Fabian told me he had asked Patricia to marry him, he came to my house with a nervousness like a son bringing a bouquet. I remembered those chipped mugs and the coffee he once gifted me in the mornings when he was small. "Would you come?" he asked one afternoon, chin lowered, eyes hopeful. Would I go to the wedding of my son to someone he loved and who was not the woman who had slammed the door years before? I hesitated, but once I had learned something about boundaries, I also learned that forgiveness can be a step when it is earned. Patricia and I met for coffee. We spoke plainly. She told me how she imagined our family, and her voice had the kind of confidence that did not try to bury anyone's past. I saw in her eyes a respect for what had happened and a hope that we could be a whole family with new rules. When the wedding day arrived, I stood on the small terrace of a parish house and watched two people promise each other a future. I thought of all the little exchanges that had led there, the payments, the therapy sessions, the nights of doubt. I was asked to say a few words. I did not make a speech about victory. I spoke about dignity and limits. I told the room that love did not mean losing yourself, and that sometimes saying no is the bravest way to protect what you cherish. "You gave me back my dignity," I told Fabian in front of people. "You forgave me the moments I was small with sorrow. What we have now is a chance to be honest." It was not an ovation. It was a hand on my shoulder from Patricia and a look from Fabian that had a softness I had not seen in years. As for Karina, her path continued to be her own. She separated from Fabian. It was a painful but honest decision. The separation was not sudden like a slam. It unfolded with small conversations, with the slow recognition that two people could not, at that moment, be healthy for each other. She moved into a rented room and continued her therapy. She came to some family dinners, but not all. She is still learning. Sometimes she calls with small updates about a meeting she attended or about a friend who helped her in a moment of temptation. I listen. I try to hold empathy and firmness together. The money I had recovered did not fix years of hurt, but it allowed me to do things I had been too proud to ask for before. I paid the dentist. I invested in a small, simple funeral fund for the future so that children now would not have to worry. I paid off a small debt that had been gnawing at me. I bought myself a chair that fit my back well. None of it was ostentation. It was a reweaving of a life that had been stretched thin. In quiet hours, I still think of the day I rang that bell with the tapper of mole in my hands. The memory sits in my chest like a line in a song. Sometimes I still feel the old sting of dismissal when I cross the threshold of a house and am not fully welcomed. But the sting has become a teacher. It taught me how to speak in the presence of people who would not let me be invisible. There were days when I imagined different outcomes. I thought I might never see my son sit at the same table with me in the way he did when he was a child. I had to grieve that. But life is full of small restitutions. There were afternoons when he would call and ask what I needed, and his voice would sound like a man who had learned to be accountable. We walk together now with the map of rules we drew, visits that are honest, help that is discussed, money that is transparent. It is not perfect, but it is ours. Sometimes people ask me if I regret selling the house. It was a rescue and a loss, but I learned something important from that sale. I learned that generosity is not an unlimited resource.
Donating your life to someone does not guarantee you will be loved in return. And I also learned that dignity lives not only in material things, but in the way we let ourselves be treated. The letter from Vicente still sits in my drawer. I read it on certain mornings when I need the steadiness of someone who knew me when I was still learning how to be brave. His words helped me find the courage to keep my voice. He wrote in his clear, slanted hand that love is measured in respect. I agree. I do not stand here as someone who won a battle against a person. I stand here as a woman who reclaimed something that was hers by right, the right to be treated with decency, the right to have choices in her own life, the right to say no without being labeled unloving. Saying no was the first step towards saying yes to myself. If there is one thing I would tell anyone listening, it is this: being kind is not the same as being erased. Protecting your dignity is not selfish, it is survival. We, especially older women, are sometimes taught to bend until we break. But you can learn to fold without tearing. You can learn to mend the edges. It takes time. It takes friends who will name what they see.
It takes paper and witnesses and a not-so-glamorous sequence of small, relentless acts. I have learned to enjoy my mornings again. I walk under jacarandas and buy fruit at the tianguis. I teach a class, and I laugh at the mistakes of young sowers who think they know everything. I write to a radio program sometimes, and they read my letters on air. People send messages that say, "We're listening." A stranger once told me she had the courage to say no to a request that made her uncomfortable because she heard my story. That is the thing that warms me more than money or papers, the idea that someone else, somewhere, felt less alone. My son married a good woman who loves us both in honest ways. Karina is on her own path, getting help. Her struggles are not a reason to hate her. They are a reason to hold accountability and to hope she finds healing. Families bend and sometimes break and sometimes remake themselves into shapes none of us expected. I still keep a small tupper of mole in my cupboard, the kind with a brown lid that Vicente liked. Sometimes I cook more than I need and bring food to my class or to the neighbor who hangs laundry across the way. I find joy in small, stubborn things, the way a seam looks when it is straight, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the taste of mole that once in a while takes me back and also forward. If you hear anything in my story, let it be this: you have the right to ask for respect. You have the right to create boundaries without feeling guilty for protecting your life. And if you do move into the territory where you must name the harm, do it with witnesses, with facts, and with a heart that still holds compassion for the one who needs help. Compassion and firmness are not opposites, they are siblings. Before I close, I want to say thank you. Thank you to the neighbors who came forward. Thank you to the lawyer who listened. Thank you to my son for finding his humility. Thank you to Patricia, who loves cleanly and without taking sides. Thank you to the woman in therapy who sat with Karina and held the space for small confessions. Thank you to Vicente, who wrote that letter and who taught me the language of gentle strength. If this story has touched you, if you have ever had to say no to protect your dignity, or if you have a story of your own about boundaries and family, please share it in the comments below. Tell us where you are listening from. Your words might give someone else the courage to name what they need. Share this with someone who needs to hear that it is okay to protect themselves. Tell them, speak kindly but firmly. We owe ourselves that much. My life is quieter now. It is not perfect, but it is mine again. I sleep with clean sheets and no longer wake to the phantom ring of a phone that brings a lie.
I wake to the sound of the street, to children playing, to the smell of beans on the stove, and sometimes to the music of Vincente in my head, reminding me that love must be mutual.
That is a kind of peace I would not trade. Tell me your story. Tell me where you are. We are many, and we are learning the same lesson. Dignity is the currency that makes life worth living.